Welcome to the Eagle Valley Model Railroad. Today we're going to build a chain link fence, and we're going to be using 18 gauge copper wire, and we're going to be using tool. I got this at my local hobby store. It's probably $2 for the pack, and it's 6 inches wide by 20 yards long. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get our wire, and all I'm using is 18 gauge solid copper. It's got a casing around it. You basically strip the casing off, and once you get you a good bit of it, you wind up with this. Basically, we're going to straighten this out. So if you watched the how-to on the tree video, we've got our screw here. We're going to make a loop in one end. It's a pitiful looking loop. Make a loop in one end, loop it around our screw. On the other end, we're just going to double it over. This will give us some wire so our drill can bite into it. We're going to take our drill and we're going to get the other end so it don't come out. We're going to pull this tight. And just turn your drill on. And believe it or not, when it breaks, it's ready. And that curled up wire winds up looking like this. Which is perfectly acceptable for making any type of post structure. And today we're, like I said, making a fence. So I got me a design out and drew my fence up. And basically what we're doing is a 8 foot tall with 6 foot sections. We're doing a rail at the top rail and a bottom rail, and we're leaving some post on the bottom of the fence so we can keep our fence off the ground level but have something to push into our foam. We're having some extra post above the fence so we can either attach barbed wire, razor wire, or clip it off flush. So an 8 foot tall fence with all our extras winds up being 1.5 inches, and the 6 foot sections wind up being 1 inch apiece. So all we're going to do is measure off our copper, cut our copper length. I drew the fence onto this piece of scrap plywood, and then I took my Dremel tool with the cutting blade and traced where I drew, and that created a groove. And you don't want to go real deep, but you want to go deep enough where it'll hold this wire in place as you solder. We'll lay our fence out into our jig. We'll put our flux on our joints, and we're going to solder this thing up. What I've done is I've cut my copper to length. I've put my posts in place. I put my rails in place. And I've had to do a little bit of cleaning up on the cuts and fitting to make sure everything does sits where we want it to sit. And now we've got it in place. And what I've done here is taken a piece of duct tape, cut it to length, and stripped it down the center. And I've got this piece of duct tape. And what I'm going to do is lay this across the posts. And that'll hold the post in place. while we do our soldering. We're going to flux our joints. And this does two things. Of course, it allows the solder to flow. But using a paste flux, like I am, it'll hold these joints as well, so it don't pop out like that right there every time. And don't be too very concerned if the rail and the post isn't seated in your jig properly. I mean, it's not going to sit there all day when you start messing with this stuff. But get it close. And as you're soldering, and the way I like to solder this, it will you can get things back in place and keep it there as you solder. So we just get all the joints fluxed. And that's what we end up with. So what we're going to do now is solder these joints. And what I like to do is start on one end and work my way back. So we're going to start on this first joint here. I'm using a wide tip on my solder, and I'm catching the rail and the post at the same time, but away from my joint, and I'm pressing it into the wood. Give that a moment to heat up. Apply some solder. Take a small flat head and hold the rail down. The posts tend to stay where they are, but the rails like to move. Hold it for a few seconds. And there we go. Now, instead of moving to the next joint right here, on this same piece of rail that we've just soldered, I'm going to go to that post, but I'm going to solder the next rail and not that same rail. And this does two things. Number one, it secures this rail. This rail already being secure, it's not going to move. So we're going to let this heat up. We're going to apply some solder. Hold the rail, lift away, and let it cool. Now once I've done this all the way to the end, I'll turn my jig around, do the other end, and by the time I come back to solder this other joint, this joint will be it'll be solid. I mean, it's solid now, but it'll be completely cooled off and solid. So I'm going to continue this, and when we get done, I'll come back and we'll move on to the next step. So now we've got it soldered, and what we're going to do now is take our Dremel tool and just clean up those joints. You don't want to grind down too much because you don't want to mess up your solder joint, but you do want to try to clean them up and make them clean them up as good as possible. So we'll do that and move on to the next step. Okay, now that we have it soldered, we're going to put a coat of paint on both sides, and I'm just going to use a dark gray, a galvanized color, anything like that, to mimic a aluminum fence post or steel fence post. So we're going to paint this up, and then we'll go from there. Alright guys, we've got the rail and the post painted. So now we're going to paint the tool. Now the tool that I have is already a gray color, but there's a little bit of a shine to this fabric when the light hits it. So when we do photos and things and have to use a flash, I don't want that glare off of this material. So what I've done is I've cut a piece, and it's larger than what the fence frame is going to be, but we can trim this up after the fact. So we're going to give this a coat of paint, and this is the way I like to do that. I like to use a flat surface to paint it on. I don't like to paint it after it's on. And the reason is you can run into a situation where you start filling in some of the squares of the tool, and that's getting rid of your detail. So what I found that keeps that from happening is I use a little bit bigger brush, and I get just the tip of the brush with some paint on it, and I just paint it. Just paint the board, paint the tool, and try to keep things where they're at. Don't let the tool move around too much. But just get a good coat of paint over the whole piece of the tool. And I won't paint all of it right this second. That way I can show you. See if we can notice the difference. But the reason I like painting it on a flat surface like this is so when you get done, before it dries, you just peel it up off that flat surface, and what you're left with is that. Now of course that's wet paint, so it's going to have a shine to it. But that just puts a little bit darker coat on the tool. Plus, this is a way to keep from filling in your details. So we've got the rails painted and the posts painted. Our frame's ready to go. And our tools painted and dried. So now we're going to glue this down. And all I'm going to use is white glue or PVA glue. And I'm actually going to paint this on. So we're going to get us a glob of glue here. And just start painting. And you don't want to put a whole lot. You just want something for the tool to stick to. And I'm painting the posts and the rails. That way the tool will stick to every part of the framework. And you won't have sections that are loose and do not look realistic. You do have a little bit of working time, but you don't want to take too long. because you want to utilize as much of the glue strength as you can. And like I say, I'm not getting a whole bunch. I know I'm coming back to the glue a lot, but I'm not getting a whole bunch on my paintbrush because I don't want the glue to come through the tool. Because it doesn't take much. You put too much of this stuff and you start getting globs around your tool, and that didn't sound right. Start getting globs through your fencing and it starts looking unrealistic. So I've got the bottom of the frame facing me. All I'm going to do is take the tool, find my straightest edge, and line my straightest edge up with the bottom of my rail. This stuff is stretchy, so you want to pull it just ever so slightly. You don't want to distort it, but you just want to get it taut. And just very gently, very little pressure, push down on the tool and get it in the glue. You'll notice you'll start getting the glue on your hands. Try to keep that as clean as possible because you don't want to spread this glue all over the tool and fill in your details, your squares. So once I've got it pretty secure, and I feel like that's good enough to where I don't have to trim up the bottom. So that's taking out a good bit of your trim work that we're going to have to do once this glues to the frame. So that was the goal. So I like the way that looks across the bottom. Again, if you see any spots coming up, get the glue off your hands. Continue to pat till it becomes real good and tacky. And this will ensure that the tool is secured to the frame. Now what I like to do is once I've glued it to that point, I'll grab this frame and push it out of where I've glued it. And hopefully we won't glue to the board. We're going to leave this here, let it dry completely, come back and we'll trim the tool out from around the frame and see what our finish is. So it's dry, and what we're going to do here is we're going to turn it over. So the frame is on top of the tool now. Take our X-Acto knife, press down on the frame, and cut right along the edge of the post. We're going to do that on both sides. Cut right along the edge of the post. That takes care of the sides. And you got to be a little bit more meticulous about this part because you've got the post higher than the top rail for your barbed wire. So you just cut right between the two posts along the top of the top rail. And just go section by section. If you scratch your post or your rail any, it's fine. You always touch it up, and they're not always perfect in the real world anyway. So what we're going to do now is turn this completely around and just reach up under the rail on the back side here and make a small cut. Turn our framework over. Starting at the first post, those two come off just fine. Now, we still have some tool that's not cut right here. So we're just going to ever so slightly pull it and start cutting on it. Doesn't take much. You don't want to distort the tool that's glued to the framework. That's what we're trying to avoid. Here's another piece that's stuck, so we just pull it just ever so slightly. And just strum it like you're strumming a guitar. You don't really want to put much pressure. And then we get this last one here. And there's our fence. Thanks for watching. Remember, like, share, subscribe, and until next time, happy modeling.